It's certainly interesting the way in which the internet trains people in new forms of snobbery, new forms of elitism, and at the same time, new forms of egalitarianism. It is remarkable that tens of thousands of people are willing to take this man's opinion seriously. I'm mostly going to refer to him by his nickname here on the internet, Rationality Rules. It's very interesting that so many people are willing to take his claims about philosophy seriously when he has absolutely no credentials in philosophy. And we're willing to listen to him snub and insult and belittle others for their lack of knowledge of philosophy, their lack of competence in, their lack of training in philosophy. That he represents a higher standard of philosophical knowledge and sophistication than his ideological opponents, his political enemies, or what have you. Now, many of you have grown up on Discord, on Reddit. You have grown up hearing again and again certain thought terminating cliches, such as, that's an appeal to authority fallacy, right? Real life, real debates about politics, in this case, real debates about gender and transgenderism and ethics and philosophy and so on. There's always going to be a complex tension in terms of the difference between authority and mere authorship. Is this just your opinion? What experience, what prior reading, what does your opinion represent? Why does it matter? And as a creative challenge, how are you going to make it matter? Now, suppose I were to insult and revile the same YouTuber, Rationality Rules. This is a totally different example, but you'll see we'll come back to the transgender issue, left-wing woke gender ideology, and these topics in just a moment. Suppose I were to criticize and insult him because he doesn't understand any language other than English. Some of you might say, and some of you might say sort of reasonably enough, well, this is a kind of appeal to authority fallacy. You are supposing, or you are proposing, that only someone who has studied Hebrew gets to have an opinion about the Bible, the Old Testament especially. Only someone who knows Latin and Greek, only someone who knows Pali and Sanskrit. That this is an unwarranted form of snobbery or elitism on my part, in contrast to, as I say, the new culture emerging on the internet media, the new culture that takes his opinion very seriously, although he has no credentials to back it up. He doesn't even have the kind of credentials that the people he's challenging, disagreeing with, and upbraiding have. That's, again, interesting. I'm not giving a simplistic, two-dimensional view of this issue. Now, many of you in my audience, and many of you who will watch this video in particular, will feel very comfortable and very self-confident in your own critique of the Bible as a text. You will feel there's nothing new for you to learn from the study of the Bible, and that there's nothing that someone who has a PhD in Hebrew knows that you don't know, or nothing that matters. And you feel you can come here on YouTube, or you can go on Reddit, or you can go on Discord, and you can stand toe-to-toe with any of these people. And if they dare to point to the fact that they have a PhD and you don't, or that they're fluent in the Hebrew language and you're not, that this is of no relevance whatsoever. What does the word Israel mean? Have you ever stopped and thought about that? Israel. You probably think that's the name of a country. You might think it's a kind of name for a religion or for a race of man, Israelites. You might, only a few of you, might be aware that it's the name of a person. That's the name of one character in the Bible. Do you know that it's a joke? Do you know that it's a play on words? Do you know that it's an untranslatable pun? Did you notice that the joke actually is rendered into English? It's actually impossible to ignore, even in the King James Version, even if it's not funny, right? And what was Israel's name before he adopted the name Israel? Are you aware that that name is also a joke? Are you aware that that whole chapter of the Bible, so to speak, that narrative is comedic? The name Jacob is a joke with a punchline. The name Israel is a joke with a punchline. And millions of people in America worship this text. And a few thousand people, like Rationality Rules, criticize this text. And they do not know what the fuck it is they're criticizing. Now, I'm an atheist, right? I recognize that from a certain unvarnished, unwashed, unrefined perspective, you can all just say, look, the only thing that matters is that I don't believe in God and I don't pray to God and I'm not going to circumcise my children. And you maybe have a short list of things like this. And that you do actively promote the theory of evolution as opposed to the religions that refuse. You say, look, ultimately, what the details of what it says in the Bible only matter up to a certain extent. Right. But that's actually not the question I'm asking. I'm asking about authority. I'm asking about credentials. I'm asking about elitism and egalitarianism, how we debate these things at all. I coined an original phrase back when I was a scholar of Buddhism. I created the idiom or created the image of Santa Claus errors. It's very brief. Once you can add this to your own vocabulary. And I would ask people, have you ever spoken to someone who's a practicing Christian, lives in a Christian culture, goes to church and so on, and celebrates Christmas every year, and they assume that Santa Claus is a character in the Bible, that like somewhere in the narrative of Jesus or something, that Santa, the origin of Christmas in this sense, that Santa Claus is actually a character who has a speaking part in the Bible. It's not a ridiculous assumption, right? If you're illiterate, you go to church, you see statues and images of Santa Claus, right? It seems like a sort of natural, reasonable assumption. Now, the reason why I use this image in Buddhist studies is, right away people know, in any European country, in Spain, Melissa was in Spain this most recent Christmas. So, do you want to estimate how many images of Santa Claus did you see? I assume mostly shopping malls and things that had Santa Claus up rather than the church. Did they have Santa actually at the church, on the church lawn, that kind of thing? No. Yeah, but anyway, whether you're in America, well, when I'm in France, I see Santa Claus everywhere. You can kind of imagine a completely illiterate, completely unlearned person who sees Santa Claus being displayed at Christmas adjacent to depictions of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and so on. They assume this is a character who is in the ancient text. They have no idea this is a much later creation. Now, every single time I've mentioned this to a scholar of Buddhism, like just right there, right at the beginning, you can already feel the tension going up because they know where I'm going with it. In Buddhist studies, in Buddhism, you are surrounded by people making precisely this type of Santa Claus error. You are surrounded by people who have no idea what aspects of the story are in the ancient Buddhist canon, in the Pali canon, what aspects are invented many centuries later in Tibet, or like really an original form of mythology that was written in Tibetan, has nothing to do with ancient India, which aspects were invented in China, which aspects were invented in Japan, in the same sense that the origin of Santa Claus is actually something radically unrelated to the story of Jesus or the Bible, but they are culturally, right? They're culturally adjacent in the world as exists today. That's the kind of problem you get into. Right? What if it really matters that not a single leader in the atheist movement has ever drawn your attention to the etymology of the word Israel before? and the significance in the Bible text of Israel. I'm sorry, any of you, by all means, you can give me a comment right now. Have you heard a single demagogue ever mention this? Have you ever heard a rabbi mention it? Have you ever heard a Christian preacher mention it? Have you ever heard any of these so-called atheist intellectuals, Richard Dawkins? Richard Dawkins has credentials in one field, but not another. Richard Dawkins did not devote himself to the study of religion, philosophy, politics, or anything else. It is well known. Some of these people have credentials. They have experience in a different field, radically unrelated to what we're talking about here. I know how easy it is for you to reassure yourself and reassure others that it doesn't matter, that none of us know what the text actually says, or that it doesn't even matter that we don't know the Jesus between, that we don't know the difference between Santa Claus and Jesus. Like we're making these kind of Santa Claus errors, right? I'm here to suggest to you it really does matter. Okay, it matters when you're engaged in a critique of Buddhism to know this is what the Buddha actually said. This is what originated maybe in a Hindu source by contrast. This originated with Jainism. This originated in China, Japan, so on and so forth. Right? And it matters whether your purpose is creative or destructive, or both. Thanks for writing in, Josh. First comment of today's live stream. If I know it's with a certain kind of apprehension that we're now going to get into transgender politics, gender identity, probably the single most politicized issue of this month, perhaps this year, perhaps this decade. But I would say this month, right now in 2023, this is the most intensely political question of our times in the very short term. And it is worth asking why. Why does this matter more right now than a long list of other issues we could be preoccupied and we could be consumed with? And why would Stephen, Rationality Rules, why would he be the person to step into this controversy to solve it? Right? Why would he be the one to make this intervention? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about who Stephen is in just a moment, and then we're going to get into the transgender issue as such, which I have made prior YouTube videos about. I used to live in Thailand. I used to live in Laos. I used to live in Cambodia. Okay, so I'm telling you who I am. I think that in those countries, around the year 2010, gay people and straight people lived in harmony, and an array of transgender and cross-dressing people lived in harmony also. And I am intentionally trying to revive the concept of cross-dressing as something distinct from and overlapping with transgenderism, okay? People can just be into cross-dressing. You can be gay and into cross-dressing without being part of the transgender movement, without subscribing to the philosophy of transgenderism. I began this decade, shall we say, without the fear or apprehension that we were on a slippery slope. And when I first heard people like Jordan Peterson ringing the alarm bell and saying, this is a slippery slope, if you give in and let this happen, it's going to go further and further and get worse and worse, I laughed. Because I thought, no, come on, we can all just live in harmony like Thailand and Laos and Cambodia, countries I've lived in and where I studied the language and so on. I was comfortable with the balance that was struck in those countries. Now, in terms of how far the transgender discourse went, I was told this verbally, but I completely believe it's true under the circumstances. I had described to me a transgender person who, when she applied for university, so some born male, dressed and behaved like one, but had not had any drugs, had not had any surgery. So again, it's just a change in dress and makeup without any of these life-altering pseudo-medical treatments. And the directors of the university simply asked her, would you feel more comfortable staying in the women's residence or in the men's residence? What's better for you? That was the option presented. And there were people who were transgender in the military, through this country. Sorry, I should transgender or cross-dressing, or into some kind of genderqueer and homosexual gender play, whatever you want to say. People, because it's not one thing, it's not one phenomenon that can be really narrowly described. And one of the moments that was most striking and most memorable to me was a group of high school students, not college students, high school students who were on a trip together. I don't know if they were camping or going to see a rock concert or what, but there's a group of them on a trip together, and they were sitting and playing the guitar together to pass the time. And there was just one transgender student among them. And you could see the straight guys were completely comfortable, just related to her as another one of the guys. This was obviously someone they'd been through school with, and up to a certain age, presumably this person dressed and behaved like a male, then at some point started cross-dressing at school. And just the extent to which, like, you could see the lack of homophobia, you could see the lack of transphobia, that they were all comfortable sitting around playing the guitar together. And as I say, the straight guys were not treating this transgender person as female. They were treating her as one of the guys. They were all totally comfortable in front of them, sort of in that sense, treated the same as everyone else. So, having grown up in an intensely homophobic culture, that one incident made a really powerful impression on me. Now, also, like any halfway decent-looking straight male, when I was in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, quite a few transgender people attempted to seduce me, made clumsy attempts, to express how much they wanted to get into bed with me, and I had to reject them. So I've also had that experience, and many of you, if you've been in town, any comments, anyone want to shout out that you've been through that in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia? I have been groped, I will tell you. I have been molested in public. I have had transgender people run up to me and put their hands on me, uninvited. And I've had to rebuff and reject the amorous advances of transgender people in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. So, I mean, that's part of how accepting that culture is too. They feel they're okay with putting their hands on you. Okay. So look, who am I and what is my bias? And who is Steve and what is his bias or what is his purpose here? And anyone in this audience is welcome to say that I lack the expertise to have an opinion on this matter. I'd be quite interested to hear that. We are dealing with a question so simple as, how do you define male and female, man and woman? I feel I'm completely qualified to have an opinion on this. I think I'm better qualified than Steve, as you're going to hear, better qualified than Rationality rules. And it maybe it's shallow and maybe it's profound for us to reflect on what qualifications do you need to come to a judgment, come to a decision on an issue so simple. So I'm going to read the only biography of Rationality rules that I found on the internet. It is not a maliciously written biography. This is not intended to insult him. I don't think there's any ill will by the authors of this. On the contrary, they're probably his fans who wrote this. I don't know if he provided some editing to it himself. Many people edit their own Wikipedia articles and that sort of thing on the internet. It's possible he's massaged this. Okay. Steve is originally from the Isle of Wight. Growing up, he was in foster care, and his mother was an alcoholic. His little sister died before her first birthday. Around the age of 8, he became an atheist after a Catholic priest told him that God was, quote, all-powerful, all-loving, everywhere at once, and all-knowing. In reply, Steve asked why there was evil. He later described the priest's answer as a, quote, word salad, close quote. He learned about evolution at the age of 16, quite late. 16. And he described it as, quote, probably the most profound experience I've ever had. He left school without a single GCSE. You can Google for yourself what a GCSE means. Perhaps someone would like to copy and paste the formal definition. Okay. He left school without a single GCSE. He then went to college and studied art and design, then art and design history, which he described as boring. Steve then studied graphic design. He studied advertising at university. I am not improving the grammar. So it's a long series of kind of sentence fragments. To my knowledge, the only university credential he has is in advertising. And it's very easy for you to imagine that he had some experience trying to study art and design and then ended up getting a degree in advertising. There's no contradiction there, but there's a very inelegantly described zigzag path that leads you to a university degree in advertising. Okay? His qualification, his credential is in advertising. Now, I just want to pause at this moment. I think there's an argument that I am one of the most influential authors and intellectuals in the history of the vegan movement, because my competition is really rather pathetic. There's Gary Francione, and then there's me, Casey Taft. It's not a lot of competition. Okay. We can look back 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and evaluate how influential I've been in the movement. But I'm aware, because I am connected, I'm within 6 degrees of separation. I'm aware of the influence I've already had, and nobody wants to admit it. I am certainly despised more than I am adored within the vegan movement. But whether you are despised or adored is quite a separate thing from being influential. You can be despised and be influential. So I am an influential intellectual in the vegan movement. How would I have been perceived over a 10-year period if this description were true of me? If I had left school, left is the verb, not graduated. If I had left school without a single GCSE and my only university experience, my only university credential was in advertising, do you have any idea how viciously my critics would have attacked me under every heading this way? And I was attacked viciously under every conceivable heading anyway, in case you don't know. Don't Google it. Well, I can imagine very well the level of hostility and scorn I would have encountered if my only credential, my only experience were in advertising. How is it possible in 2023 that an audience of tens of thousands of people is willing to listen to this guy and willing to accept what he's saying when he is pulling rank, when he is presenting himself as the authority figure who knows more than you do, who is really belittling and dismissing your opinion and the opinions of his opponents and so on and so forth, right? On the grounds that he understands philosophy and you don't. Now, my actual BA in university is in political science. My university education certainly included philosophy. It certainly included economics. And I talk a lot about philosophy. I talk a lot about economics. Politics is not so narrowly defined. But the definition of my field remains political science, politics, in plain English, right? I have never once, insulted my audience or insulted any of the people I've recorded a live stream with, an interview with, by saying, you aren't entitled to have an opinion because you haven't studied politics, and I have. So I've been doing this for, depending on how you count, at least 10 years. I've never done that once. Now, I have to give a kind of credit to my deceased father here. My deceased father was a terrible human being. I'm not going to digress to catalog this guy's sins. My father was a terrible, terrible person. But you know what? Even when I was an 11-year-old kid, 12-year-old kid, he never once said to me, in talking about politics or talking about philosophy, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about because you haven't studied this in university and I have. Never once. And he never once said, you don't know what you're talking about, whereas this book does because it was written by someone with a PhD. Never once. And, my father learned a lot from talking to me. I didn't just learn from talking to my father. My father learned the hard way that sometimes your 11-year-old son is right and you're wrong. 50-year-old man is wrong. Sometimes your 13-year-old son knows more than you do. Like, he didn't like it. He really didn't. But, my father had the often humiliating experience of having a son who was more intelligent than he was. And if you knew my father, I'm not boasting. I'm sorry, not going to digress. Really strange guy, okay? Really, really strange guy. And it was difficult for him, in part because all of his social interactions outside of the home were with employees primarily. And then, so obviously, he had some friends, but mostly he was talking to employees and business colleagues who could never put him in his place, who could never tell him he's an idiot, could never tell him he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I could. And that happened. That happened a lot. But I'm just giving credit to my father here. He did not play it that way. So, guys, if there were anyone in this audience who actually wanted to record a podcast with me talking about atheism, whether that's about Christianity or Buddhism or something, again, I really do try to treat people that way. Where it's like, maybe you have something to teach me. Maybe you understand something I don't, even if you're a high school dropout. I really do try to treat people that way. I'm disappointed frequently. Unfortunately, this open-minded attitude I have, which let's be clear. I'm not an egalitarian. I'm an elitist. Okay. But my elitism is based on the premise of the competition being open to all. Not that everyone wins, but that everyone can compete. Okay? Equal opportunity is not equality. You can have equal opportunity with incredibly unequal outcomes, right? So again, just giving a little bit of credit to my father. Okay, so I'm going to reply to your comments in the audience in just a moment. If anyone has anything else to say, so period. He studied advertising at university. Period. Steve is dyslexic. Period. He is a vegetarian. Period. In April 2020, his father died of a certain virus I dare not name. Okay. So I have a comment from the audience here. Good morning, Eisel. It's morning wherever you are. Thank you for constantly depressing me and pushing me to do more. I have no experience on this topic, but I do not understand why it is such a popular topic. Yes. Well, okay, so transgenderism is the topic. Let me say this. Communism was a political philosophy nobody was really afraid of until science fiction movies made it seem like your own best friend might be a communist and you don't know it. And propaganda films made it seem like you might be being brainwashed into being a communist and you don't know it. Once communism was made to seem like space aliens taking over America from the inside out, once communism was a threat you couldn't hide from anywhere, then people got afraid and people got interested. And there's an earlier period in the history of communism when it's just another kooky ideology kind of competing for your attention and making outlandish election claims, right? But once people start thinking about communism as a kind of contagion, right? Once it's your children that are at risk, once you're afraid that if your children go away to university, they're going to become communists, So this is my direct answer to your question, Alexandru. Uh, People in America are afraid that their children will go away to university and come back as transgender. People are afraid that their children are being indoctrinated into transgenderism in primary school, in high school, above all else in university. And so it has become, in the same sense you can talk about a Red Scare, where communism took on this new dimension. And sorry, I mentioned science fiction films. I do really think science fiction had a lot to do with it. But obviously, you can just look at propaganda and straight up, serious political discourse. Yes, this became Day of the Triffids. Use a really old-fashioned cultural reference. We could also compare this to zombie movies and so on. In our times, this idea of the ideology as contagion. Okay, so look, I said before, there's a tension with talking about things being an appeal to authority, and let's really deal with in a nuanced, intelligent way. In what ways authority does matter? In what ways what you've studied matters? What you've read matter? I've got a stack of books here from the Loeb Classics editions, right? And many people have written in to insult me about the books I have in the background. We intentionally filmed this one with a bookshelf in the background, and I'd love to tell you that we live in a perfectly egalitarian world where any of you can pick up these books. None of you need to study in university. Nobody needs to get a PhD. Nobody has to have any special respect or deference to people with PhDs. And nobody needs any language ability either. Nobody needs to study Sanskrit, Pali, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or anything else, where we can all just get on Discord and get on Reddit and logically exchange views, and that it just doesn't matter. And I think there's a kind of unspoken egalitarian ideal there. Whoa. So I don't want to lose the book. Yeah, Polybius. That one has had its pages turned, let me tell you. Yeah. Oh. Look, I think we all know there's a sense in which that kind of phony egalitarianism gives way soon enough to a much bleaker and darker kind of elitism, right? Then we're into a world where Jacqueline Glenn's opinion matters just because she's good looking, where the people whose opinions matter for reasons unrelated to formal or informal credentials, formal or informal learning. Like, what if my claim is that I know something because I've read these books here and I've read these? Like, it's not that I have a PhD. It's not that I wrote an exam, but I have some claim of some kind, and that I can demonstrate and I can show I've done the reading. I can provide the footnotes that somehow I can convince you I know what I'm talking about. I've known several people with dyslexia. Okay. Do you think it's a minor footnote at the end of this biography that this guy has dyslexia? I don't. Okay. I'm not trying to make this an ad hominem attack against the guy. I'm really not. Oh, right now you can't see any of the other books about I'm not in a shallow and summary way dismissing his perspective because he's dyslexic. But I have to tell you something. I mean, I spent years involved in the vegan movement before this book came out. This is my book. I got two of them because one of them's in English and one of them's in Spanish. As you can see, I was much better looking at the time. If I had been dyslexic, for one thing, I never could have written this book. But yes, my critics, my opponents would have gone after me. They would have taken me apart if I were a dyslexic who had never studied anything more than advertising in college. Now, there could be someone in the audience right now who matches that description. And I'm actually not trying to discourage you. I want to encourage you. Okay? If you are a dyslexic with nothing but a university degree in advertising. Okay? Do the work. Put in the work, get the results. Like, you can read all the same books I've read. You can go to all the same places I've been. Literally, you can go sleep under a mosquito net in northern Laos and learn the Laotian language and study Cambodian. You can do all the same things I've done. And you can then provide the footnotes that back up and give voice to your perspective. Whatever it is, you can make your opinion matter. But you've got to do that by actually holding yourself to a higher standard than the people you're criticizing. So a great question from Trapdoor Beaver. Great name too, by the way. Damn it. Imagine if I had named my YouTube channel Trapdoor Beaver. Imagine where I'd talk about a missed opportunity. I think I've never told the story of how I came to name my channel à-bas-le-ciel. It's largely because of the inspiration of this one other YouTube channel, an unrepentant atheist, that lately there's been so much atheist content on the channel. But the original concept for this channel, à-bas-le-ciel, was a hard-hitting atheist YouTube channel. Atheist, skeptic, and nihilist, because I'm not just an atheist, I'm also a nihilist. Anyway, Trapdoor Beaver says, quote, I am often asking people, how can you know if someone else is an authority in something if you are not yourself? And they never address it directly. Right. So if you considered the possibility that the people you're talking to are idiots. But look, this is a great topic for a separate YouTube video. I'd love to get into this in greater depth, especially from a skeptical perspective, especially from a nihilist perspective. Now, look, I could talk about my own experience in scholarship of Buddhism. We could talk about the Bible as an example. Like, how do you know who's an expert in the Bible? As you say, if you are not an expert yourself. But a really great example that you can also see books about on my shelf here is the assassination of JFK, right? So, who killed JFK and how and why, under what circumstances did Kennedy die and why? I think that's a really great example because so many people in that field present themselves as authorities, present themselves as knowing the truth with great certainty, with great passion. Can you tell who really knows what they're talking about? And then to think about how, like procedurally, how do you distinguish that? And again, today we are gathered here to discuss something much simpler than the existence of God or what attitude we should take towards the Bible or religion. We are here to discuss how do you know the definition of man and woman? How do you know the definition of gender and sex and so on? Yes, it is remarkable how few people are able to use Google. It is amazing. So someone has written asking, I've always wondered if it meant down with the sky or if it meant down to heaven. Oh, so that's your proposal, as if heaven is beneath humanity, as if you're coming down to heaven. Right. So, rationality rules, as someone has already pointed out, Kayaking King has pointed out that there was a controversy several years ago, and that I did make at least one video in response to, in which basically rationality rules and Rachel Oates themselves were accused of being transphobic. And the accusations went on and on and on and on. It wasn't a one paragraph accusation. And Matt Dillahunty was involved. Matt Dillahunty took the fight to, Matt Dillahunty, the world's greatest transgender advocate. And basically, both Rachel Oates and Rationality Rules defended themselves against this and redefined and retrenched where they stood on the transgender issue, on transgender politics. And here we are, just I think within the last 48 hours, is the next big step in that drama, in that discussion, in that discourse, in which basically Rationality Rules is now wrapping himself in the flag of current woke pro-transgender discourse. So the fuse that was lit in the last controversy was that Rationality Rules suggested in a somewhat snarky way that it was ridiculous, that it was absurd to have women and men participating in the same sports, simply because people claim they feel that they're one gender or another. And I am not saying he had any kind of coherent, well-stated argument. He just kind of made some snarky statements about this in a video. But it was obvious that his implicit point was that it was absurd. The equal competition between men and women, just because some people who are born as men identify as transgender. So he has now gone to the opposite extreme in his most recent video. He actually uses weightlifting as the example, that he feels men and women should be able to compete together in the same weightlifting class, that transgender people should be able to compete in whichever gender they like in weightlifting. Weightlifting of all sports is the example we choose. So he, on that specific issue, he has crossed the aisle, so to speak. He's coming to the side. Okay, however, that is not the controversy that he has chosen to weigh in on and voice his opinion on. He has chosen to voice his opinion on the most fundamental, and in his terms, I think the most philosophical question, which is, how do you define a man? How do you define a woman? The entire video can be summarized as follows, because it is quite repetitious and quite shallow. He says that you cannot perfectly and exhaustively define being a woman in a way that will include all instances. This is already a very interesting and significant caveat. And that this is parallel to the philosophical difficulty you get into with the definition of the word castle. Now, the reason why I've said all that I've had up to this point is that he repeatedly reviles and insults all of his opponents for failing to be as philosophically sophisticated as himself in this. There's absolutely no reason for it. For one thing, the argument he's making, as you're going to hear in just a moment, is not philosophically sophisticated. It's not something even a BA level philosophy student would advance. Again, you have to wait. I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. It's a shockingly naive, stupid, simplistic argument that, I hate to say this, it sounds like someone who has no formal education in philosophy, certainly no formal education in politics or political philosophy, someone who is dyslexic and who has done very little reading in his whole life. He sounds like exactly what he is, someone who spends his time on Twitter, possibly on Discord or Reddit, reinforcing his own beliefs. And this superiority he has over his opponents on the basis that he alone represents a truly philosophically sophisticated opinion, it's very hard to substantiate. Okay, but he says, although you cannot define woman in a way that will include all cases, so too it is impossible to define the word castle perfectly in a way that will define all instances and cases. And then we get many minutes of him reflecting on how hard it is to give a precise definition of the word castle. And very briefly, he indicates that the meaning of the word castle changes from century to century, and that's okay. Like, the meaning of castle in the 12th century is not the same as the meaning in the 18th century, and the way we use the word castle today in the 21st century is not the same. And the meaning of the word castle in Japan, right, may not be the same as in Europe. The Japanese have a different idea of what a castle is, but it's still the word castle, right? Very briefly, very breathlessly, this is fobbed off on us. Oh, what a convenient choice. How about the word slave? The word slave changes from century to century, so it's okay, right? The meaning of the word slave in the United States of America in the 18th century isn't the same as it was in Sri Lanka or Thailand or China or Japan in the 18th century. And it's not the same all over the world today. It's not the same in the 12th century and 20th, right? So the meaning of the word slave can change all the time. So it's cool. So it's okay, right? So my political ideology gets to define the word slave and impose it on your political ideology. That's the way that works? How about in Saudi Arabia right now? How about in ISIS-controlled areas that uphold Sharia law to an even greater extent than Saudi Arabia does, where they think the Quran and the will of God includes it? How about in the writing of the Old Testament and New Testament of the Bible? Oh, really? So you don't give us one counterexample where it's inconvenient or as difficult implications you deal with, like unlike castle, right? So castle can just be defined in all kinds of different ways, and it's no problem, bro. It's cool. And we can accept that the meaning of the word castle today, it's different than it was just 50 years ago. So the fact that the meaning of the word gender is different today than it was 50 years ago is no problem. So the same way that castle has a different meaning in China and Europe, so it's okay that gender has a different meaning in Saudi Arabia and in California? Are you okay with that? That's your argument. That's not my argument, bro. There's so much wrong with this argument. But let's cut to the chase here. His conclusion is the argument he advances positively, having made these caveats, having ridiculed his opponents and his enemies for their lack of linguistic sophistication, their lack of logical sophistication, and their lack of ability in philosophy, which is supposedly his area of greatest strength and his opponent's area of greatest strength, philosophy per se. I just want to say, I never do this to my opponents. I have all kinds of political disputes. I don't just say, well, I have a degree in political science and you don't. I understand politics and you don't. And no. I mean, let's just pause. Imagine a world where humanity is divided into two classes of people. Those who can have an opinion about politics and those who can't because they lack the credentials. They lack the book learning. I don't want to live in that world. That's why I don't treat you that way. Now, maybe tragically, we do live in that world. Maybe the reality is, I'm wrong. Maybe the reality is if you haven't read Thucydides and you haven't read Herodotus and you haven't read Aristotle, maybe you don't get to have an opinion on politics. Maybe it really is like that. But those are not the rules I play by. I continue to optimistically reach out to you people and get my heart broken day after day after day because I want to live in a world where we can all care about politics. I want to live in a world where your opinion matters, even though you haven't read Herodotus and I have. You haven't read Thucydides and Aristotle and I have. I want to live in that world. So those are the rules I'm going to play by. All right. And now imagine a world where there is an invidious division into two categories. There's another book that fell on the floor. There are those who know philosophy and those who don't. And people like rationality rules. They are the philosophers among us, and the rest of us are just his inferiors. With all these caveats and with his own position as superior to his opponents, philosophically superior to his opponents, logically superior, linguistically superior, the definition he humorlessly proposes at the end of the video, Melissa saw this with me, he was not joking, with a straight face, is, quote, an adult who lives and identifies as female, though they may have been said to be a different sex at birth. That's his definition of woman. Okay. What is the definition of an architect? Someone who lives and identifies as an architect. Does anyone here have like high school level education in politics, philosophy, logic, language, linguistics? Does anyone see the problem with this? You haven't answered the question, right? So it's perhaps difficult. What is the definition of an Israelite? It's not that easy to define. I'm just choosing Israelite intentionally. Someone who identifies and lives as an Israelite. So, yeah, right. That makes sense. There are some black people in Philadelphia. There's some black people in the United States of America who very vocally identify as Israelites. And they will tell you that they identify as Israelites, and they will say to you that they live as. But doesn't this just beg the same question? Isn't this circular reasoning? Isn't this a certain fallacy you may have heard of before? Yes, nevertheless, if you tell me that the definition of an architect is someone who lives as an architect, now I have to define what it is to live as an architect. I still have to answer the question, what is an architect? If I tell you that to be an Israelite is to live like an Israelite, now I still have to define what it is to live like an Israelite. Yeah, you are kicking the can further down the road. So his solution to the problem of what is a woman is someone who lives as a woman. His only education is in architecture, and he is dyslexic. I sympathize. Okay, I really do. All the years I was a scholar of Buddhism. Nobody ever said I was unqualified because my degree was in political science. Why do you think that is, guys? All my years as a leader in the vegan movement, nobody said I was unqualified because of my university. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is, guys? Okay. Rationality rules. I am saying to you, you are not qualified. And I'm not talking about a qualification you get from a university professor. I'm not talking about a qualification you get by kneeling in front of the king and having him take a sword and place it on your two shoulders and declare you a knight. This is a qualification you earn yourself. This is a title you bestow upon yourself. It's a knighthood you grant yourself. Okay? This is something you have to step up to yourself. All right. So let's do a quick shout out for audience participation here, guys. For some reason, we have fewer thumbs up than we have people in the audience. Are some of you waiting for your chance to hit thumbs down? You're still just waiting. Just sitting there waiting whether or not you give us thumbs up. Why don't you tell me, how do you define woman? What? The politically tense atmosphere of 2000. What's your definition of a woman? Why don't you guys give me some definitions? Are you afraid I'm going to tear apart your definition the way I just tore apart rationality rules? What do you think, guys? It certainly is a remarkable period of time in which this YouTuber, Rationality Rules, wants to tell you that he knows the definition of gender and you don't. He knows what it means to be a woman. And he uses this word epistemology quite a lot, which some of you are using here in the comments, right? He understands epistemology, and his opponents do not. Okay? So he understands epistemology so well that his definition of being a woman is someone who lives as a woman. So here's a really great proposal. Trapdoor Beaver. What's the best name for a YouTube channel? It's terrible. Trapdoor, you stole my name for a YouTube channel. That's what it is. Trapdoor Beaver says, quote, a woman is a person who may or may not be a woman. I did a video prior to this one, and just one person wrote in. I assume the comment is still up and visible. I don't always know. YouTube, not all the censorship is me. YouTube censors itself, so to speak, whether that's humans or, but if there's certain keywords, things disappear. And sometimes the people who make the comment, they delete their own comment. That's all kinds of things happen. But there was a comment of someone who wrote in and said, I don't understand how you can possibly say that a blood test establishes your gender. I understand that a blood test can establish your sex, but not your gender. Maybe you can explain that to me scientifically, how that's possible. All right. Now, I answered in two phases. The first was to point to the etymology of the word gender, the history of how we have used the word gender and of what the word gender means right now, right? It doesn't mean what this person is pretending it means. It really doesn't. And it never has, and it never will. Basically, the use of gender crept into its current role in our language because the word sex became embarrassing. And if you go back enough centuries, sex was the polite term that was closer to Latin. In general, we've used Latin words when we find the English words embarrassing, or the French words embarrassing, or Germanic words embarrassing. The other words, we've used Latin language as being more polite and more clinical sounding, shall we say. Okay. So in general, gender has displaced the use of sex. It's a great example where sex is still used as a verb in English with its old meaning. biologists talk about sexing a snake. It's not what you think. To determine the gender of a snake is sexing a snake, right? And again, if you have specialized expertise, you may be able to do that easily. Pick up a snake and look at it. But you can imagine if you're not an expert, it's quite difficult to discern, is this snake male or female? And it's different for each variety of snake, whether you can tell by the color patterns or by this or by that. So sexing a snake, sexing fish, this is determining the gender of. That's the old-fashioned use of sex. But because we find it embarrassing, because it now sounds ridiculous, it sounds rude, it sounds like some kind of inside joke or double entendres, we avoid using this. So this is one of our answers. But the second part of my answer cuts deeper, and it is this. What if a communist assured you that they can achieve utopia on Earth, that the communist philosophy, the communist economic system, the communist political system, it can create a utopia if just one caveat, if you accept their definition of the word utopia. And if you check the footnote, they have a really strange definition of utopia. Okay, this is a completely self-defeating argument. It's a completely pointless argument. Your side makes a mockery of itself by advancing that argument, right? And people like rationality rules, they're putting themselves in exactly that position. They're adopting the position that they have the they have the solution to this great riddle, this ultimately political problem that our society is at least momentarily tearing itself apart over. If only you will accept their definition of gender. His framework of saying that we know what a castle is empirically. Empirical definitions are never perfect. They never include all examples and instances. There are paradoxes and limits coming out of it. But because we all have enough empirical experience, you know what I mean when I say a castle. So I can say a castle in Japan, and you are not going to say to me, oh, well, that's impossible because it's made out of bricks. And my definition of a castle is it must be made out of stone and not be made out of bricks. I could have a wooden castle too, I think, in reality. But anyway, no one is going to fight over the semantics because we all derive a general sense of what a castle is from empirical experience. And the edges of this definition are imperfect, and that's okay. It's good enough. And ultimately, it's wrong to build a political ideology on a complaint that the dictionary has failed to define castle accurately enough, or that your political side is the wrong definition of castle, whereas mine has the right definition. Okay. We do not live in an historical period in which the government has declared that they are going to demolish every building over 100 years old that is not, by definition, a castle. All right? If that were the case, if there were political consequences, suddenly the precise definition of a castle would really matter. I met a man who was from a city in China that had over 300 Buddhist temples. I forget the number, but he got into it with me. But more than 300 Buddhist temples, more than 100 Taoist temples, more than 100 Confucian temples, many hundreds of Buddhist temples. I've lived in enough big cities in Asia that that's not hard for me to determine. And the government declared that they were going to demolish all of the Buddhist temples that were not of unique historical significance, unique architectural significance, cultural significance, historical significance. And they said, and now we're going to carry out a study to determine which ones have unique historical significance. This is not a democracy. This is communist China. And he told me, again, I have no memory of which city this is, but he said, people calm down. People trust the government. They're like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Because they also were aware, some of these Buddhist temples are redundant. How many temples to Guanyin do we really need? Okay, communist government isn't crazy. 2. They demolished 298 temples and they left 2. They demolished the vast majority, above 99% of all the temples in the city that are said were of no historical no historical significance, no unique architectural significance, and they were demolished. And so this whole part of their cultural and religious heritage or whatever was burned down, was demolished. And this guy was telling me the story because he wanted me to understand and relate to kind of what he and his family went through growing up in communist China and going through this tumultuous period. And again, what's most interesting and dramatic about that story was they trusted the government. Okay. All of a sudden, the definition of a castle matters. All of a sudden, the definition of cultural heritage matters. The definition of architectural significance matters. Historical significance. All of a sudden, right? When there are stakes, when there are political outcomes, when there are consequences, right? Are antidepressants effective? Okay. Now, if you're asking the question, is this drink effective in relation to weight loss? Right. The stakes are really low. Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to drink this, and you get fat anyway. You know what I mean? Like, how bad are the negative side effects of drinking? You know what I mean? Stakes low. Okay. If you just read the FDA label for any of the antidepressants, the FDA label, it's not a little, it's many pages long. Any of these drugs. Oh, the stakes are very high. The stakes are very, very high indeed. And you will realize it's not a binary question. It's not a question of, do antidepressants have more than zero positive effect? That's not the question. The question is, does this drug have an extraordinary positive effect? A positive effect so great that you can rationalize not just the risk of negative side effects, but the definite harm. Okay, I'm not saying risk, because risk suggests probability, like a roll of the dice. I'm talking about definite harm. If you smoke cigarettes, there's a risk of cancer, right? Like a roll of the dice. But there's also definite harm. Every single cigarette you smoke is damaging you, right? Even if you never get cancer. You may want, but it's harming you. It's doing damage. Same with these antidepressants. So you see, when there are consequences, when there are stakes. Let me ask you, has anyone ever said this to you before? Any YouTube channel? Any university professor? Any rabbi? Any priest? Because I've heard so much bullshit from these people. It's not just rationality rules. It's not just cosmic. I have heard so much horse shit. And one of their favorite words is utility. Okay? But yes, the definition of a word has utility, has consequences. All right? The definition of effective or ineffective, right? Talking about a drug, talking about a weight loss beverage, right? Has consequences. There's a threshold. There's a standard you have to meet. Now, for this product, this is caffeine-free. It contains no sugar, and it has 0 calories. Okay, so it contains 0 calories. Maybe that's the only definition you need to satisfy. That if something has 0 calories, you're not looking for there's nothing else you need to prove. That satisfies your definition of assisting you with. Maybe not. I don't know what your maybe there's something else you're looking for. There's some other effect or something else you want this to do for you, right? But again, what's the worst case scenario? You're going to vomit? Going to give you diarrhea? What are we risking? Right? Or it just doesn't work. You keep getting fatter and fatter while you drink a 6-pack of this shit every day. I don't know. Like, what's the worst case scenario? Okay. Well, if you just read the FDA label for any of the mind-altering drugs, right? Now, whether we are talking about rationality rules or Matt Dillahunty or Cosmic Skeptic, have you heard them talk through the effects of hormone replacement therapy? Have you heard them talk through the effects of hormone suppressing therapy? Have you heard them talk through the effects of gender reassignment surgery? just recently, we've seen Blair White finally crack on this and make videos talking about the negative side effects after many, many years of avoiding the issue, even when she was presented with questions and challenges on it. So Blair White is now open to talking to people who regret having these surgeries, despite the fact that Blair White herself is someone who has at least taken these drugs and had some cosmetic surgeries and not others. I leave this up to your imagination. Now let's think about the standard we would have to reach, right? So what I'm saying about antidepressants, it's not enough to have a simple binary test. Is there any benefit at all? Is there more than zero benefit, right? You are going to be looking for a benefit, a proven, demonstrable benefit, right? That's so extraordinary that it relativizes the harm being done. I'm not a utilitarian. Rationality rules is a utilitarian. He's a consequentialist, right? It's just such a joke. I shouldn't be the one making this argument. Why isn't Cosmic Skeptic making so? This is not my philosophy. These are not my beliefs. I'm just being real with you. But these are beliefs very compatible with their worldview, with their agenda. But when it's politically inconvenient, they won't deal with it. They won't even allow the question to be phrased in that way. The effects for a biological woman, the effects for a woman who was born a woman who has ovaries, the effects of taking testosterone are catastrophic. Testosterone is a mind-altering drug as well as a body-altering drug. Okay? It affects how you feel. It affects a lot more than how you look. It affects your perception and experience of sexuality. I have spoken to one ex-transgender person directly who admitted to me that the effects of testosterone on her vagina were so drastic that it was completely impossible for her to have sex of any kind. It was completely impossible for her to even masturbate. There was no way for her to have an orgasm. And I said to her, it's really important that you make a YouTube video about that. Because I have heard the other gender talking about that. I have heard male to female transgender people talk about how devastating it is that they can no longer have an orgasm, right? That they used to be gay men who were cross-dressing. But then when they signed up for the devastating effect this has in their life, that they can no longer have an orgasm, they can no longer have normal sexual function because of the drugs they were taking. This is without even getting into the surgery. This is catastrophic. And I said, I have never found a single biological woman of female to male transition who is willing to say publicly what you've just said to me privately. Now, if you were dying of cancer and I told you I have the cure for cancer, but there's bad news, I'm going to have to cut your dick off. Now you've got a choice. You can die of cancer or you can have your penis cut off. For some people, this is not hypothetical. Okay, you guys may not remember there was a male YouTuber who had both of his testicles cut off, not the shaft of his penis, so that he wouldn't die of cancer. And he made YouTube videos talking about it and the agony and how he felt about it and his hopes and dreams. And, you know, he had a lot of anguish and he shared at least some of it on camera. It's a tough call, bro. You are staring death in the face. And you know what? For a certain percentage of people, it doesn't work, right? You can go through the agony of this procedure and you die of cancer anyway. Well, that's cancer. That's the situation of you're dying of cancer and the solution is to cut your dick off. Now, it's hard to have an equal example for women, but we can at least hypothetically say, what if a woman has to have these kinds of surgeries? What if a woman has to start taking testosterone supplements as a cure for cancer in some hypothetical alien world, some parallel universe? You have to use your imagination a little bit here. Okay. So now we're talking about an objectively real, falsifiable medical condition, cancer, right? And an objectively real, falsifiable cure that comes at a terrible cost with terrible side effects. Could it be rationality rules that you are defining gender in this indefensible way precisely so that you can avoid dealing with the necessary scrutiny, right? Dealing with the consequences of what your philosophy really entails. If you met a communist who promised you utopia, but with that one footnote, with that one condition that first, you have to accept their definition that life in Russia in 1959 was utopia, that's what you're going back to. Stalin's Russia is their idea of utopia, and it may not be yours, but if only you'll accept it. The most fundamental significance of that argument is that people are avoiding dealing with, right? The real consequences of the philosophy that they propose.